The country between worlds. There is a place on Earth where a single step can take you from one continent to another. A narrow strip of water cuts through one of the greatest cities in the world. On one side is Europe. On the other is Asia. And every day, ferries cross between them as if the boundary between continents were nothing more than a few minutes of water. But this is not just a geographical curiosity. For thousands of years, this narrow passage has been one of the most important crossroads on Earth. Armies have crossed it. Merchants have crossed it. Emperors have fought for it. And entire civilizations have risen and fallen around it. Today, this place is known as Turkey. But Turkey is not simply a country located between two continents. It is something much more complicated. Because beneath the Turkey you see today, there are worlds that came before it. Ancient cities. Lost kingdoms. Roman roads. Byzantine churches. Ottoman palaces. And the remains of empires that once believed they would last forever. In this land, one civilization could build a city. Another could conquer it. A third could transform it. And centuries later, the modern world could rise directly on top of the ruins. The ancient city of Troy became a legend. Ephesus became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Constantinople became the center of the Byzantine Empire. And Istanbul became the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The names changed. The rulers changed. The religions changed. The languages changed. But the land remained. And perhaps that is the first secret of Turkey. It is not one country built on a blank page. It is a country written over thousands of years of history. Sometimes, the older pages were destroyed. Sometimes, they were buried. And sometimes, they were simply built over. In Istanbul, a building can begin its life as a Christian cathedral, become an imperial mosque, and centuries later remain one of the most recognizable symbols of an entirely different nation. A city can wake up in Europe, cross a bridge, and go to sleep in Asia. But beyond the images most people know, beyond the beaches of the Mediterranean, the colorful bazaars, the ancient mosques, and the tourist crowds, there is another Turkey. A Turkey of remote mountains, of underground cities, of villages hidden far from the coast, of ancient ruins buried beneath modern life, of a country still trying to balance its imperial past with its modern future. Because Turkey has always existed between worlds. Between East and West. Between Europe and Asia. Between tradition and modernity. Between the memory of an empire and the ambitions of a republic. And every time you think you have found the real Turkey, you discover another one underneath. So what happens when a modern country inherits the ruins of ancient civilizations? The memory of one of history's greatest empires. And the pressure of a rapidly changing world. To understand Turkey, you cannot look only at the country that exists today. You have to look beneath it. Because the story of Turkey is not the story of one civilization. It is the story of civilizations replacing civilizations, while the land itself remains. And the story of this land begins long before Turkey ever existed. Part 1: Before Turkey existed. The land of lost civilizations. Before Turkey had a flag. Before Istanbul had a name. Before the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, or the Ottoman Empire existed. There was Anatolia. A vast peninsula stretching between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Today, it forms most of modern Turkey. But thousands of years ago, this land was already one of the most important places in the ancient world. And the reason was geography. Anatolia was a bridge. To the west was Europe. To the east were the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Persia. To the north was the Black Sea. To the south, the Mediterranean. Anyone who wanted to move between these worlds had to pass through this region. And that made Anatolia incredibly valuable. But it also made it dangerous. Because when you stand at the crossroads of civilizations, you are never far from conflict. Long before the Greeks, Romans, or Ottomans arrived, powerful kingdoms were already rising here. One of them was the Hittite Empire. At its height, the Hittites controlled a large part of Anatolia and became one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient Near East. Their capital, Hattusa, was a massive fortified city surrounded by enormous stone walls. Thousands of people lived there. Kings ruled from monumental palaces. Temples dominated the city. And the Hittites built an empire powerful enough to challenge ancient Egypt itself. At one point, the Hittites and Egyptians fought one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. The Battle of Kadesh. It was a massive confrontation between two superpowers. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. But eventually, the two empires signed one of the earliest known peace treaties in history. It was a remarkable moment. Because even thousands of years ago, the rulers of this region understood something that would remain true for every empire that followed. Anatolia was too important to ignore. But empires never last forever. The Hittite Empire eventually collapsed. Its cities were abandoned. Its political system disappeared. And new peoples moved into the lands it had once controlled. This would become a pattern repeated again and again throughout the history of Anatolia. Civilizations would rise. They would dominate the region. And then, eventually, they would disappear. But their ruins would remain. And then came the Greeks. Along the western coast of Anatolia, Greek settlers established cities that would become some of the most important centers of the ancient world. Among them was Ephesus. At its height, Ephesus was a spectacular city. Its streets were lined with marble. Its public buildings displayed enormous wealth. Its library became one of the most famous buildings of the ancient world. And its population may have reached hundreds of thousands of people. But Ephesus was not simply a beautiful city. It was a center of trade, politics, religion, and culture. Ships arrived from across the Mediterranean. Merchants came from distant lands. And people from different civilizations met in its streets. The city became a symbol of the world that Anatolia had always been. A place where different cultures collided. And then became something new. But perhaps no ancient city connected to modern Turkey is more famous than Troy. For centuries, people wondered whether Troy had ever really existed. The city was known primarily through the stories of Homer. The Trojan War. The Wooden Horse. Achilles. Hector. A war that became one of the most famous stories in human history. For a long time, Troy seemed like nothing more than a legend. Then archaeologists began digging. Layer after layer of ancient settlement was discovered. One city had been built over another. And another. And another. The ruins revealed something extraordinary. Troy was not simply one city. It was many cities occupying the same location over thousands of years. Civilizations came and went. Buildings collapsed. New walls were built on top of old ones. And history literally became buried beneath history. This is one of the most important things to understand about Turkey. The past here is not always separated from the present. Sometimes, it is directly beneath it. The ancient world did not disappear completely. It was covered. Buried. Reused. Transformed. And eventually, the Romans arrived. Rome expanded into Anatolia and inherited many of the region's ancient cities. But the Romans did not simply destroy what came before. They connected it. They built roads. Aqueducts. Theaters. Bridges. Temples. And enormous cities. Under Roman rule, Anatolia became one of the most important parts of the empire. And then something happened that would change the history of the entire region. a new religion began spreading across the Roman world. Christianity. And Anatolia became one of its most important centers. Some of the earliest Christian communities existed here. Important religious figures traveled through the region. New churches were built. And cities that had once been centers of ancient pagan religions began to change. But the greatest transformation was still ahead. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine chose an ancient city on the Bosphorus as the new capital of the Roman Empire. The city was rebuilt, expanded, fortified, and given a new name: Constantinople. The city that would become the center of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople would stand as one of the greatest cities on earth. It would become a center of Christianity, a center of wealth, a center of politics, and a prize that countless armies would dream of capturing. But the city was not simply built in an empty landscape. It stood on the same crossroads that had attracted civilizations for thousands of years. The same geography that had made Anatolia valuable to the Hittites, to the Greeks, to Rome, would eventually make Constantinople one of the most important cities in human history. It had become the center of an empire. A city that connected continents. A city that controlled trade routes. A city surrounded by enemies. And a city that would survive for more than 1,000 years. But even the greatest cities can fall. And when Constantinople finally faced its greatest enemy, the world would change forever. Because the next empire to control this city would not come from the ancient world. It would come from a rising power that was about to transform Anatolia forever. Part 2, Constantinople. The city that refused to die. By the 11th century, Constantinople had already survived for more than 1,000 years. It had survived invasions, political crises, religious conflicts, economic disasters, and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. While Rome itself had fallen, Constantinople continued to stand. And for centuries, it was one of the greatest cities on earth. From its position on the Bosphorus, the city controlled one of the most important passages between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Trade ships arrived carrying grain, silk, spices, precious metals, and goods from distant lands. Merchants came from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. And all of them passed through the same extraordinary city. Constantinople was rich because of its location. But its location also made it a target. For centuries, armies tried to conquer it. Arab armies attacked. European crusaders attacked. And countless rival powers dreamed of capturing the city. But Constantinople was not easy to take. The city was protected by some of the most impressive defensive walls ever built. The Theodosian walls stretched across the landward side of the city. Massive stone fortifications. Multiple layers of defense. Towers. Moats. And an enormous barrier that had protected Constantinople for centuries. For generations, these walls seemed almost impossible to overcome. The city appeared to be protected not only by soldiers, but by history itself. And inside those walls was a world of extraordinary wealth. The heart of the city was dominated by the enormous Hagia Sophia. When it was completed in the 6th century, it was one of the largest buildings on earth. Its massive dome seemed to float above the interior. Light entered through the windows. Golden mosaics covered the walls. And for centuries, Hagia Sophia stood as one of the greatest symbols of the Christian world. But Constantinople was more than its monuments. It was a living city. Its streets were crowded. Its markets were filled with merchants. Its harbors were constantly active. And its population came from many different places. Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, Jews, merchants from Italy, travelers from the Islamic world, people from across the Byzantine Empire. The city was a meeting point between civilizations. But the world around Constantinople was changing. In the east, a new power was rising. The Ottoman Turks. At first, they were only one of many small political powers in Anatolia. But over time, they expanded. Their armies grew stronger. Their territories increased. And eventually, they began moving toward the most important prize in the region: Constantinople. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. The empire that had once controlled enormous territories now controlled little more than the city itself and a few surrounding areas. But Constantinople remained. And its existence was a problem for the rising Ottoman Empire. The city stood in the middle of Ottoman territory. It controlled the Bosphorus. It represented the last great remnant of the Byzantine Empire. And as long as Constantinople remained independent, the Ottomans had not truly conquered the region. Then, in 1453, a young Ottoman sultan prepared to attack. His name was Mehmed II. He was only 21 years old. But he had a goal that previous rulers had failed to achieve. He wanted Constantinople. The city had survived attacks for centuries. Its walls had resisted some of the most powerful armies in the world. But Mehmed understood that the nature of warfare was changing. And he brought something that could change the balance of power. Massive cannons. The Ottoman army assembled outside the city. Thousands of soldiers, ships, engineers, and artillery capable of firing enormous stone cannonballs against the ancient walls. For weeks, the city was bombarded. The walls that had protected Constantinople for centuries began to crack. Inside the city, defenders fought desperately. They knew what was at stake. This was not simply a battle for territory. It was a battle for the future of the region. And then, on May 29, 1453, the walls were breached. Ottoman forces entered the city. Constantinople had fallen. The Byzantine Empire was finished. But something unexpected happened next. The city did not disappear. Mehmed II understood that Constantinople was too important to destroy. It was too valuable. Too strategically located. Too historically significant. Instead of erasing the city, he made it the center of his own empire. The conquerors entered Constantinople. But the city itself survived. Its name would gradually evolve. Its population would change. Its skyline would transform. And its religious identity would be dramatically altered. Hagia Sophia became an imperial mosque. New mosques rose across the city. Palaces were built. Markets expanded. And Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. A new empire had taken control of an ancient city. But the city itself had not truly died. It had changed rulers. It had changed identity. It had changed its place in history. And this is why the story of Constantinople is so important. The city was not destroyed by the empire that conquered it. It was absorbed. The Roman past became part of the Byzantine past. The Byzantine past became part of the Ottoman future. And eventually, all of these layers would become part of modern Turkey. But the Ottomans were not simply inheriting one city. They were inheriting the center of a civilization. And from Constantinople, they would build one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. An empire that would stretch across 3 continents. Control crucial trade routes. Rule over dozens of different peoples. And transform the city on the Bosphorus into the heart of a global power. But the Ottoman Empire was about to become much more than the empire that conquered Constantinople. It was about to become one of the most powerful empires in history. Part 3, the Ottoman Empire. The empire that connected 3 continents. When Mehmed II captured Constantinople in 1453, he did not simply conquer a city. He inherited a crossroads. And from that crossroads, the Ottoman Empire would begin to expand across the world. At first, the Ottoman state had been only one of many powers competing for control of Anatolia. But the conquest of Constantinople changed everything. The city became the capital of an empire that would eventually stretch across 3 continents. From the Balkans in Europe, to the Middle East, to North Africa. The Ottoman Empire grew into one of the most powerful political systems in the world. And at its center was Constantinople. The city was transformed. New mosques rose above the skyline. Palaces expanded. Markets became busier. And the city became a meeting point for people from across the empire. Ottoman Constantinople was not a simple place. It was a world of contradictions. The empire ruled over Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Different languages were spoken. Different traditions continued. Different communities lived under the same imperial system. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire connected worlds that were often separated by geography, religion, and culture. Trade routes passed through its territory. Caravans crossed its deserts. Ships moved through its seas. Merchants traveled from Europe to Asia. And Istanbul, as the city increasingly came to be known, stood at the center of it all. The heart of the empire was the Topkapi Palace. From the outside, it was a collection of courtyards, gardens, gates, and buildings overlooking the Bosphorus. But inside, it was the center of imperial power. Here, decisions could affect millions of people. The Sultan's court was a world of politics, diplomacy, wealth, and intrigue. Foreign ambassadors arrived from distant kingdoms. Officials competed for influence. And the empire was governed from rooms overlooking the same waterway that had attracted civilizations for thousands of years. But the Ottoman Empire was not built only on palaces. It was built on organization. Its armies were among the most powerful in the world. Its administrators governed vast territories. Its cities became centers of commerce. And its architecture left a permanent mark across the lands it controlled. But the empire's greatest strength was also one of its greatest challenges. It was enormous. A single empire could contain completely different landscapes, peoples, economies, and political traditions. The Balkans did not look like Anatolia. Anatolia did not look like Arabia. Egypt did not look like North Africa. Yet all of them were connected to the same imperial system. This diversity gave the empire enormous strength. But it also made governing incredibly complicated. The Ottoman Empire had to constantly balance local traditions with imperial authority. Religious communities with political power. Regional identities with loyalty to the state. And the desire to preserve tradition with the need to modernize. For centuries, the empire succeeded. But eventually, the world around it began to change. European powers were becoming more technologically advanced. New trade routes began to weaken the importance of old ones. Military technology evolved. Nationalism began to spread. And increasingly, the Ottoman Empire was forced to confront a new world. A world in which empires were no longer judged only by the size of their armies. Industrial power mattered. Modern transportation mattered. Modern education mattered. And the Ottoman leadership began trying to reform the empire. But reform was difficult. Every change created resistance. Some believed the empire needed to become more modern. Others feared that modernization would destroy the traditions that held society together. The same tension that would later define modern Turkey was already beginning to appear. Tradition versus change. The past versus the future. And the empire was caught in the middle. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was increasingly described by European powers as the sick man of Europe. But this phrase hid a much more complicated reality. The empire was weakened. But it was still powerful. Its territories still stretched across enormous distances. Its capital was still one of the most important cities in the world. And its leaders were still trying to preserve a political system that had existed for centuries. But history was moving faster than the empire could adapt. Then came the First World War. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the losing side. And when the war ended, the empire that had ruled for centuries began to collapse. Its territories were divided. Its political system was destroyed. And the old imperial order came to an end. The empire was gone. But Anatolia remained. And from the ruins of the Ottoman world, a new country would emerge. A country that would attempt something extraordinary. It would try to break with its imperial past, while still carrying that past everywhere it went. The sultans would disappear. The empire would disappear. The old political order would disappear. But the question was what would replace them. Because Turkey was about to undergo one of the most radical transformations in its history. The empire was dead. Now, a republic would have to be built from its ruins. Part 4, The Republic. The radical transformation of Turkey. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. After more than 6 centuries, the institution that had ruled the empire was gone. The Ottoman Empire had disappeared. But the story of the Turkish people was not over. The First World War had left Anatolia occupied and divided. Foreign armies had entered former Ottoman territories. The future of the region was uncertain. And from this chaos, a new movement emerged. At its center was a military commander named Mustafa Kemal. He would become the founder of the modern Republic of Turkey. But creating a new country would require more than defeating foreign armies. It would require completely redefining what Turkey was. For centuries, identity had been connected to the Ottoman Empire, to the Sultan, to the imperial system, to a political world that stretched across 3 continents. Now, that world was gone. The new republic faced a difficult question. What should replace it? The answer was radical modernization. Turkey would no longer be an empire. It would become a nation-state. The new government attempted to transform almost every part of public life. The political system changed. The legal system changed. Education changed. And even the alphabet changed. For centuries, the Ottoman Turkish language had been written using the Arabic script. The new republic introduced a Latin-based alphabet. It was a dramatic decision. Within a short period of time, the country was being pushed toward a new future. The goal was clear. Turkey had to become modern. But modernization was not simply about technology. It was about identity. The new republic wanted to create a nation that was different from the Ottoman Empire. More centralized. More secular. More connected to Europe. And built around a new Turkish national identity. The transformation reached into everyday life. Education was reorganized. New institutions were created. The legal system was reformed. The role of religion in government was reduced. And the republic attempted to reshape the relationship between the state and society. But such dramatic change could not happen without conflict. For some people, the reforms represented progress. A break from the weakness and instability that had contributed to the collapse of the empire. For others, the speed of change was deeply unsettling. The Ottoman past had not simply been a political system. It had been a civilization. A way of life. A cultural memory. And even after the empire disappeared, that memory remained. This created a tension that Turkey would carry into the future. How do you build a modern nation without completely abandoning the civilization that came before it? The answer has never been simple. Because Turkey's past is impossible to erase. It exists in the architecture, in the language, in the food, in the traditions, in the cities, and in the memories of millions of people. A modern Turkish citizen can live in a country founded as a republic, while walking through streets that were built during the Ottoman Empire. They can enter a mosque built centuries ago. Then leave and walk into one of the most modern cities in the region. They can live in a nation that spent decades looking toward Europe, while remaining geographically and culturally connected to the Middle East and Asia. This is the contradiction at the heart of modern Turkey. It is not entirely East. It is not entirely West. It is something more complicated. And this tension became especially visible in the country's largest city, Istanbul. For centuries, the city had been the capital of empires. But the new republic made a different choice. The capital was moved to Ankara. Ankara was chosen as the center of the new nation. Istanbul remained the country's largest and most internationally important city. But politically, the republic was looking toward the future. Away from the old imperial capital. Away from the symbols of the sultans. And toward a new national identity. Yet history does not disappear simply because a capital moves. Istanbul remained. Its mosques remained. Its palaces remained. Its ancient walls remained. The Bosphorus continued to divide two continents. And millions of people continued to live in the city where the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman worlds had once met. The new republic could create new laws, new institutions, and a new political identity. But it could not erase the geography that had shaped the region for thousands of years. Turkey was still positioned between worlds. And this position would continue to define its future. The country would look toward Europe, but remain connected to Asia. It would attempt to modernize, but carry deep historical and religious traditions. It would build modern highways, airports, and skyscrapers, while ancient ruins remained scattered across the landscape. And nowhere would these contradictions become more visible than in Istanbul. A city that is not simply located between Europe and Asia, but seems to exist between different centuries at the same time. In one direction, ancient walls. In another, modern skyscrapers. A ferry crossing the Bosphorus. A mosque rising above the skyline. A subway disappearing beneath the ground. Millions of people moving through a city that has been changing for thousands of years. And this is where the story of Turkey becomes truly modern. Because Istanbul is not just the country's largest city. It is a living demonstration of everything Turkey has become. Ancient. Modern. European. Asian. Religious. Secular. Imperial. Republican. Traditional. And constantly changing. But to understand the real Turkey, you cannot only look at its most famous city. Because beyond Istanbul lies a country far larger, more diverse, and more complicated than most outsiders ever see. Part 5, Istanbul. The city that is too big to be one thing. There are cities that belong to a country. And then there is Istanbul. Istanbul feels as if it belongs to several different worlds at the same time. Every morning, millions of people wake up on opposite sides of the Bosphorus. Some begin their day in Europe. Others begin it in Asia. And thousands of them cross between the two before the day is over. The Bosphorus is not simply a geographical boundary. It is the reason Istanbul exists. For thousands of years, whoever controlled this waterway had access to one of the most important trade routes on Earth. Today, ferries move across the same water where ancient ships once carried grain, silk, spices, and armies. But the city surrounding the Bosphorus has become almost impossible to describe with a single word. Istanbul is ancient. And modern. It is crowded. And beautiful. It is wealthy. And struggling. It is deeply traditional. And constantly changing. In the historic heart of the city, the past is impossible to escape. Ancient walls still mark the boundaries of the old city. Ottoman mosques dominate the skyline. Palaces overlook the water. And beneath the streets are layers of history stretching back thousands of years. But leave the historic center. And another Istanbul appears. Glass skyscrapers rise above the city. Highways stretch through enormous urban districts. Shopping centers attract millions of people. New construction continues to transform the skyline. The city is constantly expanding. And with that expansion comes a completely different reality. Istanbul is one of the largest urban areas in Europe. Millions of people commute across the city every day. Traffic can turn a short journey into hours. Housing is under enormous pressure. And the city continues to grow. But Istanbul's biggest hidden danger may not be traffic or overcrowding. It may be the ground beneath it. The city lies in one of the world's most seismically active regions. For centuries, earthquakes have shaped the history of the region. And the possibility of a major future earthquake remains one of the greatest challenges facing the city. This creates a strange contrast. Istanbul is constantly building upward. New towers rise. New roads are constructed. New neighborhoods expand. But beneath the modern city is a geological reality that cannot be controlled. The city is powerful. But it is also vulnerable. And this vulnerability is part of the story of Istanbul. Because the city has always been forced to adapt. It has survived empires, wars, plagues, economic crises, political transformations, and the collapse of the civilizations that once ruled it. The city changes. But it never completely starts over. Instead, it absorbs the past. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Istanbul. A modern road can pass beside an ancient wall. A luxury hotel can stand near a centuries-old mosque. A subway can travel beneath archaeological remains. A ferry can carry office workers past palaces built for sultans. The past is not somewhere far away. It is part of everyday life. And this creates a city unlike almost anywhere else on earth. In one neighborhood, you can hear the call to prayer echoing across the skyline. In another, the streets are filled with restaurants, music, and nightlife. In one district, traditional markets have operated for generations. In another, glass buildings represent Turkey's ambitions for the future. Istanbul does not resolve these contradictions. It simply lives with them. And perhaps that is why the city feels so unpredictable. There is no single Istanbul. There are many. The Istanbul of the tourist. The Istanbul of the businessman. The Istanbul of the student. The Istanbul of the immigrant. The Istanbul of the old neighborhoods. The Istanbul of the new towers. And the Istanbul of the millions of people who travel across the city every day simply trying to get to work. For outsiders, Istanbul is often presented as a destination, a place of beautiful architecture, historic markets, Bosphorus views, and unforgettable food. But for the people who live there, Istanbul is not a postcard. It is home. And home can be complicated. The city can be exciting, exhausting, expensive, chaotic, beautiful, and sometimes all of these things at the same time. But the most important thing about Istanbul is that it is not the whole of Turkey. In fact, the further you travel away from the city, the more the image of Turkey begins to change. The crowded streets of Istanbul give way to enormous open landscapes. The Mediterranean coast gives way to high mountains. Modern cities give way to ancient villages. And the tourist image of Turkey begins to disappear. Because beyond the Istanbul that most people know, there is a much larger country. A country where the landscape can change completely within a few hours. A country where ancient civilizations left ruins in places few tourists ever visit. A country where millions of people live far from the famous coastlines and historic cities. And a country still struggling to answer one enormous question. What does it mean to be modern? When your past is thousands of years old? To find the answer, we have to leave Istanbul behind. Because the Turkey most people imagine, is only a small part of the country that actually exists.